So, we are already at the last presentation of the day. There will be the panel later, and then, of course, the presentation of the relay, but this is the last presentation of the conference. What was it? We all know that the question about whether language sounds are really arbitrary or not has been in mind of people, and especially economists, for a long time. So, and nowadays it starts becoming more often that talking about sound symbolism is not seen as much as taboo as it used to be. So I'm curious to see what Farrugia has to tell us about that, about sound symbolism in phone language.
Okay, hello. So my name is Farrugia. I'm going to start with just a brief introduction to my own research. I'm currently a grad student at University of British Columbia's Okanagan campus in interdisciplinary studies, which is as vague as it sounds. I work between literature and linguistic anthropology. So I'm going to state off the bat that my research is much more heavily based in literature. I am not even a little bit a linguist, so keep that in mind for the question portion. My interest in constructed language is entirely thanks to Dr. Christine Schreier, whose classes I took, and in them I was able to try my hand at the processes of language creation and study them from a literary perspective. I genuinely feel like in the world of literary studies, a better understanding of the world building tools and what is accomplished within conlangs should be of much higher academic interest. So my master's thesis specifically looks at the implications of sound symbolism and phonoaesthetics in the languages that Tolkien created and used in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I examine the phonetic choices that he made in the construction of these languages, and I discuss how they reveal particular cultural biases and ethnocentric ideologies. So, as has been discussed many times today, languages reveal cultural information. But in the context of conlangs used in literature, we're looking at information both about the imagined culture of the narrative and also about existing world cultures that are being intentionally or unintentionally reflected. Sound symbolism is the idea that phonemes on their own can carry meaning. I look at how this meaning is established at both a personal and a cultural level. But in my opinion, the more productive discussion here lies in the emotional affect of sound. For Tolkien, this was often tied to names, which I'll return to briefly. But here's an example. Carl Selfstead, a really popular Tolkien scholar, talks about with Windle as an example of a sound image that calls to mind, in this case, a slow, winding, magical river. And Tom Bombadil, which calls to mind a jolly, rambunctious person. So in the novels, we're also given a physical or character description to go along with these sound images, and they create an image of what these names designate. But it's clear that our associations are not made entirely after the fact. Ross Smith expands on this, asking if the name Tom Bombadil could have been used for a different character. It would be absurd, he says, that if the grim and severe Lord Denethor was given that name, it would just be phonetically unfit. So, in Tolkien's lecture, English and Welsh, which was delivered in October of 1955, one day after the release of The Return of the King, in that lecture, Tolkien describes himself as a philologist in the Anglo-Saxon and Germanic field, and he has always felt the attraction of ancient history and prehistory of these islands, British Isles, and most particularly the attraction of the Welsh language in itself. He further outlines his love for the Welsh language, stating that Welsh is of this soil, this island, the senior language of the men of Britain, and Welsh is beautiful. He does clarify later in this presentation that this is informed primarily by his own personal and subjective interpretation, but he undoes this claim somewhat when he asserts that there are common experiences of linguistic pleasure shared by all English speakers. He believes that most English speakers would find the phrase cellar door to be beautiful, especially if dissociated from its sense and spelling. He says it's more beautiful than sky and far more beautiful than beautiful. Some critics of this opinion have raised questions of if Tolkien was imagining this pronunciation in his own accent. So in received pronunciation, these words would sound very different from an American or an Australian accent, and even other parts of England would pronounce this quite differently. The R at the ends of the words might be articulated much more strongly, which would completely change the auditory impact. Others have challenged Tolkien's instruction to disassociate the words from their sense, arguing that this is just simply impossible for us to do. Sounds cannot be isolated from meaning. I'm sure that many of you in this room can think of particular sounds that you maybe do or don't like to include in your own conlangs, sounds that you're more frequently drawn to. And I think in these we're given a chance to examine the broader cultural forces that inform Tolkien's opinion in his own construction and our own what is pleasing when we write our own languages. Now, of course, the languages that an English language speaker would perceive to be more beautiful depends not only on their own personal linguistic taste, but also on their social relationships and their knowledge of groups of other language speakers. As linguistic anthropologist Catherine Willard has discussed, though, this relationship is only ever partial. The impact of our cultural background contributes but does not entirely define the way that we ascribe meaning to sound. Language affect has become a much more popular topic of study, and along two major lines. You've got the role of affect in language acquisition and the role of affect in poetics and performance, which is much more my side of things. The role of affect of language in poetics is particularly important. The practice of writing literature or creating languages alike must be concerned with the affect and emotional response that writers wish to evoke. While authors are obviously concerned with affect and how it relates to sound when writing generally, conlangers have a particular investment in the system of sounds that they choose to utilize because they are essentially unlimited in what sounds they can include. So it's only natural that the affective quality of these sounds should play a role in their selection. My research looks specifically at Tolkien's constructed languages, and sound is very important to the way that we interpret the languages and in turn the cultures found in Middle-earth. The way in which affect is encoded into sound is very difficult to study in natural languages, but I think in the case of constructed languages, we have a unique opportunity to examine the impact that the phonological elements of conlangs have. The sound symbolism present in Tolkien's languages is related to the importance that he placed on phonetic fitness of sounds. The reason that such factors are important for conlangers to consider more generally is that they create a system wherein not only do certain sounds have more value than others, but in turn, certain languages, like natural languages, are deemed phonologically better than others. What I mean by this is that incorporating certain sounds, certain natural language sounds, into particular Middle-earth cultures, Tolkien creates a hierarchy of value amongst not only the cultures in the text, but also those natural languages and cultures which influenced their construction. This happens through the association of natural languages and cultures that are closely linguistically paralleled in Middle-earth. I think the most important example of this would be the case of the Elvish languages, Sindarin and Quenya, which borrow from Finnish, Latin, and Welsh, divided between the two. And by associating these privileged natural languages with the linguistically superior cultures within the narrative, those who have the power within the text to cultivate their own language. So for those of you who are less invested in Tolkien lore, it's the elves who are granted the power to enrich and cultivate their own forms of speech. So the fact that they end up sounding quite similar to Welsh, Finnish, Latin is, I think, pretty telling of Tolkien's commentary on those natural languages. The natural languages that Tolkien links to his most celebrated and distinguished cultures, like the elves, he adds value to in a particular way that readers may consciously or unconsciously pick up on. The importance of beautiful sounds of Finnish and Welsh appearing so frequently in Elvish is that they serve to reinforce very Eurocentric ideas about natural languages and cultures. In addition to that, a book as widely influential, or books as widely influential as The Lord of the Rings will undoubtedly have had an impact on languages in fiction more broadly. So, the linguist whose work I use most frequently in my thesis is Otto Jespersen. He was a big proponent of sound symbolism. He believed that sound symbolism influenced the way that language formed, but also how it operates on an ongoing basis to make words more applicable or appropriate for their reference. In 1922, he challenged the Sassurian idea of arbitrary reference, and he asked if there was really much more logic in the opposite extreme, which denies any kind of sound symbolism, apart from the small classes of onomatopoeia, and sees in our words only a collection of accidental and irrational associations of sound and meaning. Jespersen wrote that it would be absurd to maintain that all words at all times in all languages have a signification corresponding exactly to their sound, each having a definite meaning once and for all. He nevertheless felt that sound symbolism was still significant, adding that there are words which we feel instinctively to be adequate to express the ideas that they stand for. For any of you unfamiliar with Jespersen, he was an early supporter of the Esperanto offshoot Ido, and he published his own conlang project, Novio. I'm a big fan. Related to affect and phonetic fitness are ideophones, words that are not necessarily onomatopoeic, but whose phonological structure encodes meaning. These words are rich in effective meaning. Ideophones do not appear frequently in English, but they are in other languages, like the Ghanaian language Cebu, which uses giddy giddy to mean running energetically. And we've also got phonostemes. So a phonosteme is part of a word that tends to carry a certain connotation, not because of etymology or formal definition, but just by association. So one example would be the sound GL, so words begin with GL, glow, gleam, glimmer, glitter, glisten, etc. These are not related historically, but they all have the idea of reflecting light. And then another example would be words that begin with SN, so snoop, sniffle, snot, snore, sneeze are all vaguely nose related. This is not to say that all words with those letters have that meaning in common, but there is a common thread among a notable set of them. So within Peirce's theory of signs, the phonosteme is considered to be an icon rather than a symbol or index. An icon is a sign that denotes its object through a quality which is shared by them, but which the icon has irrespective of the object. The icon, for instance, a portrait or a diagram, resembles or imitates its object. The icon has a certain character or aspect which the object also has, or is supposed to have, and which lets the icon be interpreted as a sign even if the object did not exist. So I turned to take a look at conlangs in fiction more broadly, and this is an example that linguist and author James Harbeck posted about in a really fun blog, and it's looking at the phoneme more. So here's examples of where more shows up in constructed worlds. We've got Professor Moriarty, Voldemort, Morbius, the Mines of Moria, Uncle Pork. So respectively, those are Sherlock, Harry Potter, Doctor Who, and Spider-Man both have a Morbius. Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, Arthurian legend, and then anyone here fans of Terry Pratchett? Yes, yes. So it's not actually an evil place, Uncle Pork, but it is kind of like dirty.
Well, it's like New York.
Yeah, exactly. It's vaguely sad. We're supposed to understand that it's not a great place to live. So these are not simply phonostemes, this sound, because we've got the Germanic root mora for darkness, which shows up in words like murky. Our modern word for murder comes from the Old English morth. You've got the Latin mor, which is and mort, tied to death. So these aren't really along the same lines as those examples I gave of glitter and gleam. But I think the fact that this sound is so pervasive across fiction is really interesting, because in con worlds, every time that another name is added that fits this trope, it adds weight. It adds to the weight of association. So sounds may not carry discrete or overarching meaning, but they do carry an effective meaning. They carry an emotional impact that may be difficult to assess, but it's important to think about, particularly as we understand how sounds can hold pleasure. When we write, it's important to be mindful of why particular sounds may be pleasurable or displeasurable, and these associations are often culturally motivated, and keeping this in mind is important because it can lead to the creation of ethnocentric conlangs, which we all want to avoid. Okay, I sped through that a little faster than I was supposed to. I'm ready for questions.
LCC6 that Weinhoff gave a paper about how different conlangers responded to the sounds of conlangs.
Yeah, that was the first presentation of the LCC6 was about the LCC6 was about the result of a survey about that.
Yeah, there's lots of and one of those associational things, I mean, this is not a question, but if you don't know her work, you should find it interesting on this. People who heard Dothraki and thought it sounded like Arabic liked it less than people who didn't think it sounded like Arabic.
Yeah.
Do you know that the word mor means black in Elvish? Mordor means black man.
Yeah.
So I imagine that was intentional.
Yes, I think that was probably borrowing from Latin.
Yeah. Or from the Germanic, if it means like dark and Germanic, like death.
Yeah, I don't know. He didn't make a ton of. Well, I mean, he made a ton of notes on one or specific things, but there's a lot of internal conflict. He has different etymologies for each word that he created, so I'd have to do a little bit of research on that one specifically. Yeah.
I'm thinking can add Morlock, Burrows and Morlocks to your list.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry, H2O. And the Morgana from the Arthurian.
Morgana, yeah, that works.
Morrigan.
Oh, see, for me, Morrigan is a character from BioWare.
Morrigan, great, it's Maor in Welsh. It means more great, so great queen or
Ah, and great here meaning crazy.
Great is terrible, yes.
Yes.
So this is a bit more specific to Tolkien.
Hmm.
So you talked a lot about how specific sounds, like the whole spiel with Welsh, Kenya, and Sindarin. I was wondering if you feel that Hustu having sounding much more Semitic based has anything to do with the fact that it's the secret language of dwarves, and whether this could be tied, I guess, to preconceptions of the time that existed regarding Jews and Jewish people, and like if that reflected, or that was reflected by the way Tolkien kind of approached dwarves.
Yeah, I'd say for sure. Writing on Crystal, unfortunately, there's actually only a brief mention in one of the appendices of a dwarvish sign language that was easier to communicate across. I wish there was more on those languages, rather limited. And the scope of my project has worked on paper than